Hello and welcome to the Muni Credit Cast from Build America Mutual, our monthly podcast that identifies some of the questions investors can be asking about the credit quality of their municipal bond portfolios, because
if you've seen one muni bond, you've seen one muni bond.
That's my co-host, Suzanne Finnegan, BAM's Chief Credit Officer, Municipal Market Expert, and the author of our official podcast catchphrase. Today's topic is resilience, which is an important word in credit analysis, especially in bond insurance analysis, right?
Absolutely, Mike. BAM guarantees timely payment of interest and principal for the life of every deal we insure. So we have to take a long-term view. And part of that is understanding that unexpected events will happen in that time. Anything from a recession to a natural disaster like a hurricane or earthquake. And we want to know if the issuer's finances will be resilient in response to them.
And from that perspective, you'll appreciate hearing from our guest today, Farhad Omeyr from the National League of Cities. Farhad just completed NLC's annual research report on municipal infrastructure conditions, and this year the report focuses in on infrastructure investments that are necessary to improve resilience at the local level. One thing that was clear from his findings was that city and town leaders who responded to the survey think it's really important to factor resilience into their capital plans. It's still early in the process, but we've started to see those kinds of projects and transactions BAM has insured, right?
Yeah, that's right. For instance, we've seen water treatment plants that were located in low-lying areas where they were exposed to damage in flooding. So a city or utility system might invest in relocating them to higher ground. We've also seen projects to add air conditioning to school buildings to help students and teachers in hotter climates.
And another finding in the report is that these local leaders believe that local resources are going to have to pay for a significant part of the costs of these projects. And a lot of analysts think that's going to mean a significant increase in municipal bond supply. Is that a credit risk investors should be asking about? How can BAM or really any investor understand the risk that an issuer might sell more debt than they can afford in the future?
That is another issue where the details matter. It's common, but not universal, to see an issuer agree to what we call an additional bonds test, where they enter into a contract with bondholders that limits their ability to sell bonds unless they clearly have or will be able to generate the revenue needed to pay for them. It's also really important for investors to understand the flow of funds. Every issuer has multiple claims on its revenues, and you want to know where the debt service on your specific bond stands.
And of course, as we mentioned in other podcasts, if you buy an insured municipal bond, you're receiving a guarantee of timely payments of interest and principal. Let's go ahead and hear from Farhad, and then we can circle back at the end to tie up any loose ends. Farhad, thank you for joining us today. This year's NLC Municipal Infrastructure Condition Survey was different than other broader surveys you've conducted in the past. From the get-go, it started with a definitional question to understand the specific projects and specific risks we're talking about when we use a catch-all term like resiliency. What results did you get?
This year, me and my team, basically, we focused solely on resiliency and infrastructure resilience, basically, given the state of events currently in the global events, basically with regard to global warming, right? So we asked governments what is, with regard to climate change and global warming, what effects of what hazards are actually most predominant when it comes to overall in the United States and local governments. And stormwater flooding followed by extreme weathers were the two main climate hazards experienced by our surveyed governments, basically. When we asked about the type of infrastructure most affected by these climate hazards, water and sewer systems and transportations were the two main categories of infrastructure most affected and vulnerable to climate change.
So, what did you learn about where these risks rank in terms of the hierarchy for city leaders?
So, this is not, of course, what we expected to realize and understand when we did this research, but this is unfortunate, but rightly so. Resiliency and infrastructure resiliency is not yet on top of priorities for local governments, at least the surveyed governments in our sample, right? Only 24% of responding cities use climate data in capital budgeting planning actively, and 70% have not conducted a climate risk assessment of their infrastructure. One thing of note here is we surveyed the same sample of governments for this piece of research that we always do for city fiscal condition or a state of the cities, other flagship reports that we provide here at National League of Cities. Surprisingly, the response rate for this report actually was much lower. As you can see when you download the full report, you will see the response rate for this piece of research was much lower. And that's telling. This is still gaining traction. Resiliency at local level is still gaining traction. And maybe at this point, I'm glad we did this research, but that reminds me of a discussion we had with a colleague of mine actually from ICMA. They did similar research with some similar theme a couple of years ago. They came to the same conclusion that the response rate when we are discussing resiliency of infrastructure is a little lower than when we ask other questions.
So I'm wondering if we could dive a little deeper into the results. The survey began to uncover some of the barriers facing resiliency investments, including financial obstacles that might be addressed by additional federal funding or more utilization of the municipal bond market, right?
It was obvious that government, right from the get-go, we knew that we should ask this question: why governments are not more involved with resiliency aspect of infrastructure in their budgeting and planning for infrastructure, right? There should be barriers and obstacles. And we were right. The most important barrier is lack of funding. Despite BIL, despite all the help that governments are receiving, lack of funding is still, first and foremost, the most important barrier for entrance into this discussion for governments, followed by implementation capacity, which is not at all surprising to me because majority of we basically surveyed NLC membership. So NLC members we have more than 2,700 member cities from across the country, and they are a good representative sample of municipal governments here in America, meaning majority of governments are smaller populated areas compared to Chicago's of the world or New York City's of the world, right? So implementation capacity, we knew would be one of the biggest barriers, basically, and the data actually shows that. Regulatory and policy challenges. This was also mentioned by a lot of governments as an obstacle. Basically, what state mandates for local governments has a lot to do with how ready they are at this point when it comes to resilience of their infrastructure and having support when it comes to these matters. Lack of public awareness was surprisingly also mentioned by a lot of governments. When I asked, on an anecdotal note, when I talked with a couple of these governments, this seems to be the next obstacle these governments are ready to tackle. Basically, talking more with the public to the point of benefits of resiliency, if that makes sense. Lack of funding, as I mentioned, was the most important obstacle. But at least the good news, the silver lining here is that 67% of our surveyed cities are planning to apply for federal grants before fiscal year 25-26, meaning the next fiscal year, basically. And the more governments apply and get grants from state and local governments, the more they will be ready to tackle these issues.
It's fascinating to hear that you got feedback that people are laying the groundwork now to talk to their communities and discuss the importance of resilience investments now. 80% of bond referendums submitted to voters last year were approved. Part of that is because certainly voters understand the importance of infrastructure. Part of that is because of the hard work local government leaders do every day, both building financial credibility, but also explaining the need for these projects to their communities. And that was not by accident. And so the projects that are submitted to voters are ones that have already, to some extent, been vetted, and you have community alignment around them. So I think it's interesting that that leadership cohort that's done so well in building support for road improvements and school improvements and other things is now turning its attention to resiliency.
We ask governments, all right, so you told us about your hassles there, your obstacles and challenges and all of that, but where do you see growth opportunity? Majority are relying on their local capital and operating budget. When asked which other organizations are more often partnering with your city, your governments, MPOs, meaning metropolitan planning organizations, and counties were the two major organizational bodies helping cities when it comes to planning and strategizing, basically, for infrastructure resiliency.
So you mentioned one goal is the opportunity to incorporate climate data into other levels of capital planning. I think that's a really interesting concept. Could you give us more of a sense of what exactly that looks like? How can it potentially impact decision making?
Oh, absolutely. So basically, when a government, let's just look at it this way. All governments do capital budgeting to some extent, right? But some of these governments who are at the forefront of actually caring too much about resiliency of their infrastructure, they do actually take the costs associated with these plans and what is it called? The strategies, different strategies that will affect in the long term their infrastructure and the maintenance of their infrastructure into account. Okay, so I'm talking about not just a CIP, capital improvement plans. I'm talking about they actually have a master plan for the next decade or so, the next 20 years, let's say. Not just that, some of these governments do have a resiliency manager or director, okay? Not majority of them, of course, that we surveyed, but some of these governments do have a position just for the sake of taking care of resiliency aspect of their infrastructure. It's not just a public works director. It's not just a finance director. They actually embedded in their governments that position. So all of these, that investment will pay off, of course, a couple of years down the road when the cost of their maintenance is 1/3 of a similar government without this position, without this forward thinking, basically. The funny thing is, and I'm going to just channel into our next flagship report that will come out in July. Look forward to that State of the Cities research. As part of that, this is just a tease of data I'm going to share with you here, is we asked mayors about their major, most important priorities for the fiscal year 2024. Economic development is number one and infrastructure is number two. But funny, when we asked the same question, but this time took into account the data we collected from Twitter and other social media to gauge the public interest, infrastructure was number one and energy and resiliency and environment was number two. So both categories of infrastructure, especially resiliency and environment from the viewpoint of the public, was number two. This is interesting because we are at the cross section where governments are realizing that public actually starting to care about the long-term aspect of their cities, their environment, and all of that, right? So as we move forward, my expectation would be governments will more and more invest in this area, in a sense that 10 years from now, hopefully we will see many positions similar to what we saw this year with regard to, I don't know, a resiliency director or a master plan just for resiliency aspect of their infrastructure in many governments. So that was a very, very positive things that we are actually observing as part of the next project that we are doing.
For our listeners, that discussion was excerpted from a webinar BAM sponsored with Farhad and the National League of Cities. BAM has a long-term partnership with the National League of Cities. We are the preferred provider of bond insurance to their members. And you can watch a full playback of that on our YouTube page, including slides with more details about the research findings. Suzanne, before we sign off, Farhad's comments were about how local leaders are approaching resilience, but as he noted, that's still a very new discussion. How do you and the analysts at BAM incorporate resilience into your analysis?
Mike, we've always paid a lot of attention to natural disaster risk facing bond issuers, and we're focused on gathering as much information about those risks as we can. So we'll look at any disclosures an issuer is making, but we also pull in data from a variety of sources. Some of them, like FEMA's National Risk Index, are available to the general public for free, but others are specialty subscription databases aimed at municipal bond investors specifically. We use the data differently depending on the specific revenue streams and the legal structure of a transaction. For example, some transactions that rely on revenue streams associated with specific properties or infrastructure, while others are community-wide. We also recognize that a hurricane is not going to respect town or city borders. So we also have portfolio-level limits for credits within regions that are specifically exposed to severe weather events.
Thanks for those insights. I'd echo your spotlight on the NRI. That data is available at the county and census tract level, and it can really help investors understand a community's exposure to potential disaster risks and its resilience if they occur. That's our podcast for this month. Thanks for listening, and thanks again to Farhad Omeyr for sharing his research findings with us. The Muni Creditcast is Build America Mutual's monthly podcast about municipal bonds and credit analysis. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Build America Mutual is rated AA with a stable outlook from S&P Global Ratings, and we insure more than $100 billion of municipal bonds from across the U.S. For more information, please email us at creditinsights@buildamerica.com.